Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, welcome to tonight's panel discussion with the experts on the topic of organ trafficking in China and plastinated body exhibits. Tonight, we will examine what has been labelled as modern-day medical genocide by some. It's a crime of vast proportions, yet one that has been grossly underreported. The widespread crimes of forced organ removal from unwilling and non-consenting individuals is a violation of the most basic dignity of a human being. But then to go one step further and build an entire industry around a kill-on-demand process sometimes is indeed hard to believe. I would like to acknowledge our hosts for tonight's event: Australian Lawyers for Human Rights. ALHR was established in 1993 and is a national association of Australian solicitors, barristers, academics, judicial officers and law education, networking, research and training. ALHR promotes practices and protects universally accepted standards of human rights throughout Australia. And visiting us all the way from Canada for this week, Dr. Matus is an international human rights lawyer and widely published author. He has been actively involved in a number of human rights organisations, including Amnesty International, B'nai B'rith Canada, Canada Council for Refugees and the Canadian Jewish Congress. Dr. Matus is co-chair of Canadian Helsinki Watch Group. He is also the co-author of the 2016 updated report into state-sanctioned organ harvesting for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010 for his groundbreaking research into forced organ harvesting. And Dr. Matus is one of the co-founders of the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse, or ETAC. Next to David, we've got Professor Maria Fitaroni Singh. Professor Fitaroni Singh is a professor of medicine at the University of Sydney, is a geriatrician whose research, clinical and teaching career has focused on integration of medicine, exercise physiology and nutrition as a means to improve health status and quality of life. She is a member of the international NGO Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting and has been actively advocating for changes to the abusive organ transplantation practices in China. And finally, Madeleine Bridget with us tonight, Peter Duffy Human Rights Scholarship awarded by the Honourable Society of Lincoln's Inn. She was initially called to the bar in England and Wales in 2011 and later called to the New South Wales bar in 2016. Having worked for the European Court of Human Rights and for the Bar Human Rights Committee of England and Wales, she fearlessly advocates for the protection of human rights while actively promoting the rule of law. She is the current co-chair of the Business and Human Rights Subcommittee for the Australian Lawyers for Human Rights. Please give them a warm round of applause and for joining us tonight. China, as opposed to other regions in the world where we of course know people go to India, people go to Pakistan, they might go to the Philippines and they might come back with a kidney. But what makes China so unique and so different?
What makes China different is that organ transplant abuse in China is state-directed, state-organized, state-run. In other countries, it's a black market which is private and the state may not control it and the state may not be corrupt, but it's in different components, but it's not as heavily implicated. I mean, what we see in China is the organ transplant abuse running through military hospitals, the regular health institutions. We see, of course, the vilification of Falun Gong is a state policy. We see the arbitrary detention of prisoners of conscience and Falun Gong and others that are targets of organ transplant abuse, also a state policy. The whole organ distribution system in China runs through the courts and the prison system, because organ distribution in China started with prisoners sentenced to death and executed, and it never really shifted. And so, I mean, we had, when we did our initial report, we had investigators calling into hospitals asking if they had organs of practitioners of Falun Gong for sale, relatives of patients, pretending to be relatives of patients on the basis that and they're making these inquiries on the basis that Falun Gong set of exercise, the practitioners would be healthy and their organs would be healthy. And many calls, the hospital said, well, call the courts or call the prison, because they were the organ distribution system. I mean, you simply don't find that in any other country.
Thank you. Madeline?
The only thing that I would add to that is that in some of the black market industries that you see, the person who is selling their organ will get some money back, for example. So that person, and those people are generally vulnerable people who may be poor, and they are selling their organ on the black market, and they will get money, or someone will get money in exchange for that. In China, that transaction doesn't occur. So the person not only doesn't consent to the process, but they don't receive any form of benefit, if you can call that a benefit. I mean, there's still concerns about those types of transactions and the legalities around those transactions, and whether you can truly say that that person who's vulnerable is really giving informed consent. But what you see in China is a completely different picture. It's nothing like that black market that you may see on TV or watch in documentaries. What happens in China is a mass-scale crimes against humanity that breaches fundamental human rights laws, which I can talk a little bit more about later.
I just wanted to mention also, I think in this light of shadowy figures in the darkness doing transplants, it's completely different in China. The surgeons involved in this industry have been high-profile surgeons and practitioners who are seeking the limelight, who are seeking actually to get a lot of credibility with their Western counterparts, and are members of the Transplantation Society, have gotten medals of honor from that society. And in fact, the gentleman you saw on the screen there, Huang Jiafu, who is the person who actually started the entire transplant industry in China, was educated in Australia at the University of Sydney. So that's where he learned how to do liver transplantation. So we taught him. He took that back to China and was the instrumental figure in actually building up the entire transplant industry. And he has ingratiated himself with all of the top surgeons in Australia, internationally, in the US, in the WHO, in the TTS, the Transplantation Society. So far from being in the shadowy darkness and operating like that, these people are actually operating right out in the open, right under our noses. And in fact, when we discovered that Huang Jiafu was not only trained at the University of Sydney, where I'm on the faculty, but looking through our website, I noticed that he was actually still an honorary professor at the University of Sydney as of a couple of years ago. So we mounted a campaign to actually get this title revoked, because he's obviously violating the ethical standards of the University of Sydney. And it took about 2 years and 6 letters to the Vice Chancellor before they finally just let his title slip away. They refused to actually fire him. So we are complicit. We are completely complicit in this incredibly horrendous industry, and therefore it's not enough to actually sort of go home in horror. As Australians, we actually have to do something to right the wrong that our country actually helped create.
I believe recently you've authored a paper on what you called cold genocide. Could you maybe give us just a few minutes as to what you meant by the term cold genocide?
Okay, well, I mean,
sorry, grab your microphone.
To a certain extent, those are different questions, although they do overlap. What I meant when I was talking about new form of genocide, I mean, of course, that's 12 years ago now, so it's not as new now as it was then, but what I had in mind was that it was new technologically. The capacity for good and evil is sort of part of human nature, and that hasn't changed. But what does change over time is the technological capacity for both. What made the Holocaust so devastating was not so much that people all of a sudden started to hate the Jews. I mean, anti-Semitism is historically extremely old. It's just there was trains, there was chemical gases, there was a bureaucratic development, there was developments in medicine and so on that made it technologically possible for the mass killings to occur, which couldn't have been organized in such short order years or decades before. And the organ transplantation itself is new, or relatively new. I mean, it didn't exist at the time of the Holocaust. It's developed in recent years, and like all technology, it's morally neutral. And the people who develop these technologies, I mean, unless they're developed for military purposes, don't really think of them as being used to inflict harm on people. Or certainly organ transplantation was developed for the purpose of helping people, not harming people. And as a result, it wasn't developed with the precautions put in place to prevent the sort of abuse that developed, because the people who developed it didn't imagine the abuse. I mean, I'm confident that people who developed transplant technology didn't think of it being used to kill prisoners of conscience. And so we were left with a system, a technology that had no defenses against its abuse, and then you had this repressive regime who needed a lot of money and vilified population and a kind of an inexhaustible organ donor bank as a result, and we see the result. Now, in terms of cold genocide, that's an academic article I wrote with three others, a kind of interdisciplinary article with a doctor, a social worker, and myself as a lawyer, and a researcher that talked about the concept of cold genocide, which itself is not a new concept. It was developed in the context of colonialism, where genocide isn't noticed. Genocide's very slow. And we talked about the killing of Falun Gong and putting it into this context and it's also multidimensional. It's not just killing people, but forcing them to convert so they can't maintain their spiritual beliefs, destroying them spiritually. And so we applied this concept to this phenomenon, and it was innovative enough as an analysis that it was considered worthy of publication in an academic journal. And it is available. It was published in the Journal of Genocide Studies, and it is available online in case anybody wants to read it.
Certainly. Thank you, David.
What China has said is that, well, up until 2005, they denied that there were any executed prisoners used for organ transplants. And then it was admitted finally by Huang Jiafu in 2005 at a meeting in Spain, I believe, in Madrid. But not much was really said about stopping it. And then in 2010, they said that they started their first actual donation system. So the first time that they were going to get away from using executed prisoners, which, if you don't know, everyone agrees in the world is not an appropriate source for organs. So there are statements that are internationally accepted as that isn't ethical. So for the first time in 2010, they said that they were going to get away from that. And in 2013, said to have started a donor system, and that sort of continued over the next 3 or 4 years up until 2015, where they said that finally they've actually completely made the transition from executed prisoners to all voluntary donations. So if we go to the next slide, the question is that a plausible sort of reasonable response to the number of transplant that they're actually saying they're doing? So by comparison, if we look at the United States, which is the country that does the most transplants in the world, in the US there are about 138, as of the end of 2017, 138 million people registered as donors. So there's an active organ donation system. It's an opt-in system, not an opt-out system. So about 54% of the entire US population is registered as an organ donor. And in 2017, there were about 16,400 donors total, and half of those were registered. The other half were people who died unregistered, but their family agreed to give their organs, and because they felt that it was in their person's wishes, even though they hadn't yet registered. So something like 46% of all organs transplanted were donated by these registered people. So every person who gives their organs generally doesn't just give one organ. If you die, you get on average about 2.5 organs per donor is what you get. So what you end up with at the end of 2017 in the United States is 42,000 transplants were performed, organs of various kinds, from about 16,000 donors, some of whom were registered and some of whom weren't. So that makes sense, and this system is incredibly transparent. You can go on to the donation website in the United States, and it's updated every second. The numbers change, and you can see exactly who's donating, what states they're in, what the waiting times are, who's living, who's deceased, what was the cause of death. All of that is absolutely, completely transparent, which is what the WHO requires, essentially, of countries to do. So other countries have similar systems, like Australia. So if you look on the next slide there, what you see is that of these 138 million people who are registered in the United States, about 7,500 of them became donors, right? Because you register long before you die, usually. So only about 7,500 became donors in the year 2017, and that was about half of all donors. So the other half were unregistered. 42,000 organs. So about 0.01% of the registered donor pool became donors. That's sort of the percentage. So it's a very small percentage of the pool, right? Then that's a typical sort of scenario for opt-in systems around the world. So China says that they have 375,000 people registered on this voluntary donation system. Now, there's no public sort of registry that you can look on to verify that, like there is in the United States, but that's what the official figures say. And they say that something like 2,600 of those became donors, and they comprised, again, about half of the total donors, although this figure we don't really know, we're just estimating from the United States, to result in 15,000 organs. So 15,000 exactly is what they say they transplanted, so that's a little suspicious right then and there. And those figures have been sort of 10,000, 10,000, 10,000, 15,000. So even if you believe those figures, which as you saw in the video are vastly underestimated from the capacity that they actually have, that's probably the capacity of 2 or 3 hospitals out of the several hundred that are operating. That would mean 1.54% of registered donors registered people became donors. So 154 times higher than the United States, which has had a donor system in place for decades, right? This system has only been in place for 2 or 3 years. It's impossible to believe that number of registered people could actually generate even 15,000 organs, much less, as David said, the 60 or 100,000 transplants that are actually taking place. So it's completely implausible that this voluntary donor system is actually supplying the organs that are actually being transplanted, even if you believe this minuscule number of 15,000 organs a year.
The actual numbers come from the individual hospitals, just adding up their what they say on their websites, their bed counts, staff counts, cross-checking with the bed counts, staff counts, the newspaper reports, the internal newsletters, the research reports. And I mean, this is a constant experience with the Chinese. Anytime you quote from them, they just take down the data stream. It's a continual cover-up. So their response to the numbers was to shut down all the postings in the hospitals of their volumes. I mean, we've archived everything. We had 2,200 official footnotes out of 2,400 in our June 16th report. Wang Jiefu, his reaction to our report when he came out, he said, when I read that, I lost some sleep. I mean, that was his answer. There is... And I should say, even in terms of their numbers, I mean, of course, what Maria said is quite right. And realistically, what they're doing, we also had callers calling into donation centers, and the donation numbers in donation centers are just tiny, very few. But what they're doing is they're actually buying organs and up to 39 times annual income from relatives of patients who are in hospital accident victims. And they are getting some organs doing that, but not enough, not nearly enough to meet even their claim volumes, let alone the actual volumes. And one of the things we see and continue to see is organs, you can book organ transplants, which in advance, even for vital organs, which wouldn't happen if you're dealing with accident victims.
Madeline, did you want to add something?
A couple of points just regarding the car accidents. I'd be really interested to know when they are actually taking the organ from someone, a victim in a car accident in China, whether that person has actually consented or whether they just see it upon themselves to do that transplant and then let the family know later, or maybe not even let the family know later. So I think there's still really concerns about whether even at that point consent is being given when you're dealing with we're not dealing with a democratic country. We are dealing with a communist regime that has incredible amounts of control over people. People cannot think freely, people cannot speak freely, and if you do, you may well be arrested for treason, and treason results in the death penalty. Now, Amnesty International have been trying to get the figures for how many people are executed from the death penalty, and they've never been able to get accurate numbers. So China's not been transparent about those numbers, which you would think, why not? Because you have a death penalty that's legal under your regime, so why not provide those numbers? So we can't expect that we're going to get accurate data from an illegal transaction, if you like, or an illegal act. So the other thing that I just wanted to say, which I find absolutely appalling, that China can come out and admit that they have done organ transplants from executed prisoners and think that that is okay, because that in itself is not okay, because it raises major concerns whether a prisoner can voluntarily give consent, and in my view they can't give consent. And if someone is on death row, they definitely cannot give informed consent. So the fact that they've come out and admitted that, in my view, is extremely concerning. So whether it's from executed prisoners or prisoners of conscience, in my view, that's a major concern.
Just on that point, I wanted to say, you've mentioned executed prisoners.
Prisoners source for a number of reasons. One is, at the time they were saying they were getting the organs from executed prisoners, they didn't have a national organ distribution system, so everything had to be sourced locally. Secondly, you need blood type compatibility and ideally tissue type compatibility, so you can have a one-on-one between the patient and the source. You need practically 10 sources for every patient in order to have a reasonable chance of a match. There's a lot of disease in the prisons, hepatitis B, which makes a lot of the organs unusable for the prisoners in the criminal population. And the law says there has to be an execution within 3 days of sentence. If you're going to do that, again, you get the problem of patient coordination, and which we didn't see. I should say, in terms of government statistics, I do a lot of human rights work, and one of the things that I was involved when I was trying to find out what happened to Raoul Wallenberg, who was somebody who helped save Jews from the Holocaust and then was arrested by the Soviets, and the question was what happened to him. And then the Soviet Union collapsed, and they released a lot of their files. And what you could see them doing was not providing information, but providing disinformation according to certain criteria, which was what was known, what would go over, what is potentially sellable outside. They made no efforts to search the prison records or their own files. And that is my view of what's going on in China right now with statistics. They're not producing statistics based on what the hospitals tell them. They're producing statistics in order to look good, to justify what they're doing, to present a plausible story abroad.
The other thing I just want to say in terms of the statistics here in Australia, we have up to 1,400 people on a wait list at any one time in Australia for an organ. So that gives you an indication that what's happening in China is not usual.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you have the next?
Yep. David, you want to give a brief comment?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I could say. First of all, you heard the person being interviewed say the government pretends not to know, and that's a very common reaction. Wang Jiefu is a transplantation doctor, which means he would insert the organ into the patient, but there's a different operation where they actually extract the organ from the source. It's usually done by different medical teams. And so in one time when he was being interviewed, he said he went to one of these extraction teams to see what was going on. He was so horrified he never went again. And that was his reaction to it. I mean, this is a form of criminality. It's willful blindness. I mean, doctors were executed in the Nuremberg trials using this defense. The Wang Heibo, who's a number 2 in the Chinese medical system after Wang Jiefu, spoke at the transplantation conference in Madrid that I was at, and I went to hear him speak, and he was asked about this Korean documentary. And he said, I can't say very much about it because the nurse who was interviewed there is now a fugitive from justice, and it's going through the court system. So the real crime in China is not killing innocents for their organs; it's talking about it. And also, what's unusual here, like what she was talking about, is it's unusual for the foreigners. That's atypical or undercover. But for the Chinese, this is just normal operating. Chinese patients, it's just normal operating business.
Yeah. Maria?
Yeah, I was just going to say, essentially, Huang Jiefu is, as I said, he's a liver transplant surgeon, and he has admitted, and there's records to just verify that he's himself transplanted over 500 livers at the time when it was all coming from executed prisoners. And when he's been interviewed about this by the ABC, he basically said, why do you object? He had no moral sort of compass that was indicating that there was anything wrong with doing that. And now this gentleman, if you want to call him that, has this serial killer, which is really what he is the current, head of the new system that's meant to be transparent and open and free of any kind of moral problem. So, I mean, would you put a serial killer in charge of a new organization designed to stop crime? I mean, you obviously wouldn't. But that's exactly what China has done. I think, is on the next slide, Sophie, you have in terms of the waiting times, you don't have that one? Oh, no. Maybe not, that's right. The waiting time, as Madeline says, in America and Australia, about 5 years for a kidney is the typical waiting time. There are only, I think, 273 kidneys transplanted in all of Australia last year. So it's hard to get organs when you have a voluntary system in place that is transparent and ethical and doesn't coerce families. And even, as David said, a lot of the families now where organs are being sourced from, these are people dying in ICUs after whatever it is, motor vehicle accidents or something where they're not old and diseased. They die suddenly when they're young. But the way they're getting the organs is by paying the families huge sums of money, many, many times greater than their annual income. And that coercion is also considered illegal and unethical by, again, the WHO and the TTS. So, and that part of the system isn't really hidden as much as some of the other parts. And so these people who are creating this new system, they seem to be living in a moral vacuum. They're not operating by the same rules that the rest of the transplant community is, and things that are so basically wrong, like coercion and lack of consent and paying families to steal organs from people who don't know about it. None of that seems to faze them as an immoral activity. So it's
Did you want to? Sorry, Madeline. Did you want to add something?
I just wanted to add one thing, which is Maria's just touched on, that even if a person consents to their organ being donated, the exchange of money makes it unethical. So that's important for us to know that. So ethical organ donation happens by consent, voluntarily, and with no exchange of money. It's almost like a civic duty, if you like, civil duty. So that exchange of money in and of itself makes that unethical.
And I went on to the web to see if I could get an organ myself. So there is this website, which I just accessed again last night at midnight. And it's called kidneytransplantservice.com. Talks about how wonderful the transplant business is in China and how good the organs are, what their success rate is, 90% success in terms of transplant. What hospitals do it, Peking Union Medical College, Guangzhou, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce these names, and so on. So you can go there, and then if you stay on the website, and you guys can do this yourselves, stay on the website for more than a few seconds, a little chat box opens up, and it says, "Hi, I'm your kidney doctor. I'm a real doctor. I'm not a robot. And would you like to discuss, what your needs are?" And so I did that. I think at the next slide. So I'm a true doctor, not a robot. Feel free to question me. So I said, this is all on WhatsApp. I would like a kidney transplant as soon as possible. And I think on the next slide, we exchanged a few. I think is there one more slide? Yeah, we exchanged a few words about what my problem was. I pretended I had polycystic kidney disease. My creatinine was rising sharply. I wanted to avoid dialysis. They asked for my phone number, which I gave them, and then the doctor called me or said, "I'll call you within 24 hours." So this all happened within a matter of minutes. I did receive a phone call from this doctor on my mobile phone, which you see listed there. And on the next slide there, basically it took from 1:17 in the afternoon to 1:26 p.m. Before the doctor promised to call me, and he did. And on the next slide, it basically said I asked for his name. He gave me his name, told me what the hospital was. I asked him how much a transplant would be, and he said he could treat me with dialysis. If that failed, then we could get a transplant. Cost would be about $60K USD for a kidney transplant. Have the same experience that I did.
Thanks for sharing that.
In terms of legislative and legal, the UN has made some interventions. The United Nations Committee on Torture. China is a signatory to the Convention Against Torture, as a result of which it has to report periodically to an expert committee, which then makes concluding observations. And so they have, since our report came out, twice made concluding observations expressing concern about the evidence of organ transplant abuse, asking for perpetrators to be brought to justice, and asking the government of China to cooperate with an independent international investigation into the reports of organ transplant abuse. There's been resolutions to the same effect with the European Union Parliament and the House of Representatives, the US Congress. There has been some legislative changes since our report came out in Israel and in Italy and in Spain and Taiwan, basically legislating an extraterritorial crime for organ brokerage or organ tourism or facilitating the sale of organs through money. In Israel as well, they've cut off insurance, private and public insurance for people traveling abroad where it's transplant tourism. In the United States, they've started asking, they ask if you apply for a visa in the U.S. if you've been involved in organ transplant abuse. Now they'll involve people. They will not allow people in, and they will remove people who've been involved in organ transplant abuse. So those are some of the changes that have been made.
Sure. Madeline, did you have anything to add?
I just wanted to add some of the limitations in terms of what we can do using international law and even domestic law here in Australia. Some of the limitations are people will know that China is one of the 5 powers in the UN and they can veto anything that goes through the UN, and that's a very difficult hurdle to succumb. Also, China are not they're not a party to the Rome Statute, so we can't necessarily use the International Criminal Court. It depends. There may be some ways of using that, just like the Afghanistan-US thing that's going on at the moment with the Rome Statute. But there are, unfortunately, some limitations around what we can do. And also China is obviously not a willing party to engage in international law on that level. That makes it that makes it extremely difficult. On the positive, though, some people may have noticed in the ABC news 2 weeks ago, there was a new UN report that's been released stating that they're now estimating that there's possibly up to 2 million Uyghurs in labour camps in Xinjiang. We've not really even mentioned much about the labour camps, and then that in itself raises major legal concerns, the fact that people are actually being detained in labour camps. So there's crimes that are being committed before the organ harvesting actually happens, which is people being detained without a right to a fair trial, people's liberty being that their right to liberty is being impinged. So there's a lot of stuff going on in China that cuts across a lot of international human rights laws. But the good thing, that UN report is very promising, because the more publicity there is about that stuff, the more pressure China will have from the international community about closing down these labour camps, and we can only hope.
Yeah, thank you. Maria, I'll put this next slide for you. Yeah, just put the next slide.
Yeah, so I'd have to say that the response of the medical community has been less than overwhelming. And as I mentioned, it was extremely hard to get Huang Jiafu, you see pictured here, dismissed from the University of Sydney, and he actually wasn't dismissed, they just didn't renew his honorary professorship. In recent years, he's become very high profile with all of the sort of major international organizations, with the Vatican, with the Transplantation Society, and there really has been a real tendency to just believe what he says. So again, this is a serial killer who has admitted to having no moral problem with transplanting, 500 livers from executed prisoners, who is now the head of this organization. And yet people are willing to sort of look past his past crimes and believe that he's telling the truth now, when he's been lying for years and years, for many years, about what's going on. On the next slide, I think, so Wang Haibo, who's now the director of the China Organ Transplant Response System Research Center, has been telling everyone that this national system is now open and transparent, and that the government no longer allows these kinds of illegal activities. And then you have people who come out in support of that. So Philip O'Connell, who is again at the University of Sydney, and has been the recent head of the TTS, has said that in the past people didn't believe what was going on because of lack of knowledge, but now we have open and transparent knowledge, so everything's okay. Frank Delmonico, pretty much the world leader in transplant medicine internationally, has said that he agrees with O'Connor. The rumors have been effectively countered by the transparent and complete data Chinese authorities provided, which is ridiculous from those numbers that I showed you, where they're pretending that only 15,000 transplants were done. David's research suggests it's 60 to 100,000. They pretend that they can get all of those donors from the mere 300,000 people on the registry. They don't admit that the organs are still coming primarily from unwilling or people who die, whose families are being coercively paid to steal their organs. So these apologists for China, who are the biggest names in the transplant industry field in the world, it's just shocking. It's absolutely shocking. So there are some fantastic doctors who oppose what's going on, who've been, who founded the Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, and who are working against this. There's a large number of those doctors, but the heads of the relevant organizations like the TTS, WHO, et cetera, have really not stepped up to the plate, and they've been in the mode of saying we must, keep dialogue open, we must engage with these people, we must move them gently in the right direction. I just don't buy it. I don't think it's the way. I think when somebody is as evil as these men have been, they have to be called on that, and they can't be leading the new ethical system into the next millennium.
Look, exhibitions, just like museum displays, in and of themselves are not problematic. Where the problems arise is if you don't know the source of, we're referring here to bodies and specimens, but it would be the same as any kind of artefacts in museums. And in fact, there is a lot of dialogue happening at the moment about human remains of Aboriginal people in museums. And there are two key points to be made about these exhibitions. They need to be able to show the documentation as to the provenance of the bodies and the specimens, and that word provenance, it's a lovely word, and I've started to use it. I didn't know what it actually meant until about 6 months ago, and about a completely unrelated. I'm using it a lot. I'm using it all the time. It's a lovely word because when you look it up in the dictionary, it actually means the origin of something, and that's exactly the right word to be using here, because you want to know the origin or the source of the body of the specimen. So that's the first key point. The second one is that you need to have documentation showing the consent, and not just consent of you can do what you want with my body when I'm dead. You actually have to have specific consent. I want my body or my arm or my leg or my heart to be used in this exhibition. It has to be express, what I would call express written consent. Now, the organisers of the exhibition in Sydney, to my knowledge, well, they definitely have not done it publicly because we've not seen it, have not produced that documentation. So in view of that, it's my opinion that that exhibition is not operating legally or ethically because it breaches fundamental laws around organ donation, just on that point, let alone perhaps the whole plastination process. So no problem with exhibitions, museums, displays, a firm believer in all of that, but it has to be done ethically and legally, and at this stage we've not received any of that documentation.
Indeed.
And there's another related point, which is kind of bringing it back to the organ transplant issue. Again, if you'd like to go on the website for this plastination factory in China, you can order your own plastinated body, and you can order whatever you want, including, for example, because it's one of the things they list explicitly, a pregnant woman at whatever gestational duration you would like, so she can be. And there is a one that they show with a woman who has an 8-month-old fetus baby that they're cut open and displaying. So just like with the organ transplants, where you can get an organ in an unreasonably short period of time, you can put in an order for a pregnant female with a 5-month-old baby and get that delivered to you within a matter of months or whatever it is. It takes a while to make these specimens. So the fact that you can order somebody, in a certain position, of a certain age, of a certain gender at will makes it quite difficult to understand how these people could have suddenly died. Just the ones that you wanted happened to die just in time for you to plastinate their bodies. So the whole thing reeks of illegality. And the other part that's very interesting is that the factories where this was carried out, and these bodies are from 2000 to 2004. They're not new, and they're obviously Chinese. You can see that. They come from that region of China where there were huge labor camps of people who were prisoners of conscience being held. So there is a lot of evidence around that we don't have time to go into that suggests that in fact these same labor camps that were supplying organs for the transplant industry were also supplying bodies for the plastination business. And it's a huge business. These bodies cost several $100,000. I think an organ alone costs a couple $100,000. The body, whole body, I don't even know what it costs. So yeah, lots of issues.
So the history, so we can piece the puzzle together for you, because obviously we know about it. We're probably speaking about it as if you would know about it as well. So just the history. So the person who created this or developed this plastination process is a German doctor called Gunther von Hagen, and he developed this and set up a plastination company in China, and it was around 1999, which is also around the time when the Falun Gong were on mass scale put into labour camps. And he then had a protege called Sui Hong Jin, I
Jin.
think. Jin, thank you.
Jin.
Yes, Sui Hong Jin. And like most relationships, I think there was some conflict and they argued and they went their separate ways. And it's Sui Hong Jin who set up the Dalian-Hoffen Biotech Company, which is where the Real Bodies exhibition in Sydney sourced their bodies and specimens.
Do you want me to show those little slides?
So,
Yes, you might.
yeah, so what I would like to do is provide a warning and offer for anybody to leave the room if you don't want to see these photos, because they can be distressing. I mean, they're on public websites, anybody can have a look at them, but you probably wouldn't do that in your spare time. So please feel free to leave if you don't want to be exposed to them. And I know it's late at night, and I know I probably don't like to see these things before I'm going to bed. So this is the Real Bodies exhibition. So you would have seen this. Can I just say that those words there make me really, really happy. Last chance, closing 16th of September. They make me happy because this exhibition was actually supposed to run throughout October, and I don't know whether it was the beginning of October or the end of October. But we would like to think that a lot of our advocacy had something to do with them closing. We don't know why they're closing early, but an exhibition like this doesn't close early for no reason. And there were quite a few sequence of events that happened before we found out they were closing, which were some significant meetings with the Ministry of Health from two very people, a doctor and an ethicist academic who had meetings with the Ministry of Health to talk to them about their concerns and our concerns about the exhibition. We wrote an open letter to the Premier, New South Wales Premier. We wrote letters to the Minister of Health, Commonwealth, and to the Minister of Health. The state, the responses, which actually I received another response today, just today, have been farcical, if you ask me. The Commonwealth blames the state and the state blames the Commonwealth. When I say blame, that blame's not the right word. The Commonwealth will say it's the state's responsibility and the state will say it's the Commonwealth's responsibility, and then nobody does anything about it. Anyway, it's just mind-boggling. Anyway, they're closing early, which is great. So the next slide... I thought I'd show you this because this is how they promote the exhibition, that it's got this education element to it. So they have actually, on their website, they say that they've partnered with New South Wales Schools. I'm not sure if New South Wales Schools knows that on their website, because the other thing on their website they say, and if you're hearing some cynicism in my voice, it's because I'm absolutely just gobsmacked at this organisation of how they've gotten away with so many things along the way, including how they got these bodies and specimens into the country. So on their website, they also say they partnered with Cancer Cure Australia. And I spoke to the CEO of Cancer Cure Australia yesterday, and she had no idea that they were listed as a partner on this website. And what they did was they threw a bunch of free tickets to Cancer Cure Australia, and they said, here's some tickets, and we're going to do a barbecue, and we're going to raise some money for you, and we're going to give you some money. Do you know how much money they gave them? $150. It's about $35 a pop, is it? $30? $35 a pop to get in there. And it's been running for months. And they give a cancer organisation $150. Okay, so you can see they're doing a lot of education. Students are going, and students, it's on the radio, you're hearing about it. I mean, the amount of money that they've spent on advertising is quite incredible.
They produced this, I've printed it out, the Educators Guide.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a guide, and you can have a look on there.
It sort of talks about all the wonderful things that you're going to learn in this exhibition, in making it sound like it's partnering here with New South Wales education standards as well. So it's all making it very legitimate.
So this is the Dalian-Hoffen Biotechnic Company, and in there, when you go under one of their menu bars there, it will take you to the specimens, and they don't just do with bodies and human parts, but they also do animals and so if we go to the next slide, so we are going to come to the slides that you may find a little bit distressing. So these are the specimens that you can order. The one up there on the right, I believe, is the pregnant.
Not yet.
No, the next is it the next one? Yes, the next. Seed, you can't bring nuts, but lo and behold, you can bring bodies and specimens. So they classify the items, if you like, that come into the country are classified, and there's a particular instrument, which is the Biosecurity Managing Human Remains Instrument, 2006. It's actually quite a new piece of legislation. Well, it's an instrument, but it's, you know, part of the regulating of the Act. And in there, it will classify the human remains. And depending on the classification, will also result in what you need to do to get that human remains into the country. So if you're classified under classification 2, you have to get written, and I'm just going to grab it because, sorry, just bear with me for a minute because I do want to get this right. That's right. So if it's classification 2, which is that the remains are going to be used for scientific or research purposes, then you need to have a written declaration stating that the bodies or the human remains consented for them to be used in that way. So that's a good thing. But there's 3 other classes, so there's 4 classes in total. The other classes, so there's class 3, which is like this other category. So we're not exactly sure what this class 3 is, but it puts in brackets things like displays, etc. Now, we got our hands on some Freedom of Information documents to find out how they've been classified to enter into Australia. We are still trying to get some information, but it looks like, we're not 100% sure, and we're going to get more information, but it looks like they haven't been classified as class 2, which you would expect, given that this is promoting itself as, you know, scientific, educational, that it would have been classified as class 2, which would have meant that that they would have been asked for a written declaration. On reviewing this instrument a little bit more, sorry, Sophie, I'll just finish this a little bit more. What I've seen, though, is that there's also an or. And whenever you see that in legislation, you just kind of go, because it's another thing, which means that it's either a written declaration or just or permission from the human biosecurity officer. So basically, in short, it's really easy to get these human remains into the country, and we're going to be doing a whole lot more advocacy to try and either tighten up some of these laws or just raise some awareness with biosecurity about these human remains coming into the country.
Yeah, thanks, Madeline.
Sorry, that was a bit long.
That's all right, but just important work that's going on, and just to highlight that it is possible to amend legislations, because just recently we've learned just in July, I believe that recently, is that right, David? In the Czech Republic, they've amended the law, and now they have to have consent documentation accompany any human remains that are being imported into the country, so they can't bring them in otherwise. And that was as a result of that exhibit being in the Czech Republic at the end of last year with the same controversy, obviously, that unfolded. I'd just like to, we've got a few more minutes before we'll open up the floor to some Q&A. There were some quotations which I've certainly read for the first time from a 2004 article that was titled The Merchant of Death, and that was published in a German weekly called Der Spiegel. So this is back in 2004, so about the same time when these bodies that we've just seen on the screen were being plastinated. And what happened was a couple of reporters from the German publication actually travelled to China. This is at the time when the German guy, the inventor, was still around. He was still there doing these, plastinating the bodies. He was still in business then. And they detailed what they saw. So they had some very first-hand accounts of what was going on. And I'll just read a couple of this for you. In mid-January 2002, another 60 complete bodies arrived at the Dalian plant by rail in a reserved freight train car. According to a confidential report, between November 12, 2001 and mid-January 2002, 160 bodies were shipped to the Dalian plant's underground storage facility. Department head Zhu Rui, by the name of Zhu Rui, warned that warehouse space is running out. 151 Der Spiegel reporters went to the von Hagen Dalian plant. Oh, sorry, not 100. So Der Spiegel reporters went to the Dalian plant in November 2003. They investigated. They recorded an inventory of 647 complete body specimens and 3,909 dismembered body parts, such as legs, hands, penises, etc. In addition, there were 182 embryos, fetuses, and newborns within these facilities. And it goes on to say that some of these were classified. So basically, the corpses with defects were stored separately in a freezer, accompanied with records detailing flaws such as skull open, broken neck, etc. For example, a body by the number of 03MIO77 was tagged raw material. Another cadaver labelled body of a man. Others were said missing left eye, foot, hand damaged. And others were said with a label called worth exhibiting. So that just sort of gives us an idea of what was going on back in 2004. This is not commonly, this information is in German. I've actually personally found the file of this German report. It was all in German, so I couldn't read it, but luckily this report now provided some translations of what was actually in that report, and it really was quite shocking to read this. And
one of the things that struck me about it is the supposed justification that these bodies are unclaimed. This relates to the persecution of Falun Gong, because the Falun Gong community, there was a kind of a catch and release system, and their immediate environment was victimized for not turning them in or not converting them. As a result, when they went back and protested again, the bulk of them did not self-identify, and they would remain in arbitrary, indefinite detention. It became a source for organ transplants, but because they didn't self-identify, their families didn't know where they were, and the jailers didn't know who they were, and so they would be unclaimed. There's a 1984 Chinese law that says you do not need the consent of a person to dispose of his body parts if the body's unclaimed, and so there's a direct linkage between the law and the organ transplant abuse and the plastination. I view the plastination as kind of similar fact evidence. It's kind of a parallel activity that, and there's, I mean, in some ways it's more blatant, because after a report came out, they shut down the price lists and a lot of the more blatant advertising about buying organs. Now you can still sort of dig it up, but it's not as easy to find as it used to be, and people try to pretend it's not there, or they cover it up. But I mean, with the bodies, you can just, it's public in China and abroad. You just go online, you make your order, you pay your money, and you can have a body in your office if you want. And they just put it in a box and send it to you, and it's all kind of legal. I mean, the secrecy is sort of further down the line at the sourcing, but at the front end, it's much more public, and of course, it's a lot more visible. So people can, in some way, I mean, you can't really see the organ transplantation, but you can see these body exhibits. You can see what's going on.
Can I just add to that in terms of Tom Zeller, who is the CEO of and the organiser of the Real Bodies exhibition. These are a couple of things he has said publicly. He has publicly said that the bodies and the specimens are from China, so he has not denied that. He has publicly said that they're unclaimed bodies, and as David has just explained that, and the other part I understand of Chinese law is that an unclaimed body becomes an unclaimed body after 30 days, which in my mind, that's not very long for a family member to look for someone. So you've got a month to claim that body before it's classified as an unclaimed body. He also said publicly that all the bodies and the specimens had died of natural causes. Now, when I spoke with the CEO of Cancer Cure Australia yesterday, because I was curious as to their involvement, she said that he had told them that there were bodies and specimens of people who had died of cancer, and there's a reference to that now up on his fax. Now, the fax in Real Bodies, when you go into the fax, keeps getting amended and changed. So it's concerning that there's someone who's manipulating the system here in Australia and benefiting from such atrocities and crimes against humanity. And the plastination industry is an extension, and it's definitely would, in my mind, be classified as part of the crimes against humanity.
Just one last point is that plastination is a means of preserving the body, obviously, and you can't plastinate a body that has started to decay. So you actually have to do it either within a few days while the body is kind of under cold storage, like in a morgue, or the body has to be completely frozen, which could happen like in a -80 freezer, and then you could do the plastination later. So for the bodies to be unclaimed for 30 days and then plastinated means that they have to have a hell of a lot of freezers going, waiting for all these bodies, for 30 days. So I don't think that it could possibly be true that these are unclaimed bodies with a 30-day waiting period. It seems much more likely that, in fact, and again, because of the fact that you can order them on demand, just like you can get your organs on demand, means that they're probably sourcing them in relatively real time as orders come in from, and many of these are going to universities for anatomy labs and things like that, probably not private offices so much. But the fact that you can order them on demand and get them, within a reasonable period of time means that probably they're not unclaimed bodies which have been lying in a freezer for 30 days. It just seems completely unrealistic.
Also, just to add as well, we've seen they're all young bodies. What happens in Australia is we do also have unclaimed bodies. I've just found out some information a couple of days ago that we've got apparently 500 unclaimed bodies in Australia, which nobody came to take. But most of those, the demographic is the older, patients who may not have family members.
Plastination lab in New South Wales, and if you go on their website, you can see very clearly how you can become an organ donor, and you have to very specifically say, I agree that my body can be plastinated and used in anatomy labs and medical schools. So that is the local source of plastinating bodies in Australia, and you can see, how above the board and how absolute the consent must be for that process to take place. So none of us are saying plastination is wrong or it shouldn't happen. It's really about whether or not this is related to prisoners and prisoners of conscience and organ harvesting, and whether it actually is in violation of human rights law internationally.
Thank you. I think we might end the discussion here. Thank you very much. Why don't we give our panellists a big round of applause?
A reprehensible industry like that requires two major factors to facilitate it. One is motivated demand, and staying alive is pretty good motivation. And the other is the ability to pay for it. And most of the people, the vast majority of people I understand who have these transplants could not afford it naturally from their own resources, and they have been supported by Western medical insurance companies which have done the cost analysis and have found that it's much cheaper to pay for people to go to China than to keep them on a waiting list in a Western hospital. What, and David touched on this early, what in fact is being done in advanced Western or financially advanced cultures to stop that happening?
Yes, well, there was a change in the law in Israel, which was because the public insurance system and the private insurance system in Israel not only paid for the transplantation, they paid for the airfare, they paid for everything. So then they passed a law that saying these insurance companies couldn't do it unless the country to which the person was going had standards for transplantation as good as or better than Israel. But as far as I know, they're the only country that's done that. In Australia right now, the Subcommittee of Human Rights of the Committee of Foreign Affairs, it's a joint committee of the Parliament of Australia is looking at this issue. They've had some hearings and they're putting in a report at the end of this year. And I met with the chair yesterday in Canberra, Kevin Andrews, and I'll be sending him a note suggesting just that Australia enact this legislation. But we certainly need that legislation, not just in Australia, but worldwide. This is one of the things I said at the beginning, and when I was talking about answering this question about the new form of evil. When David Kilgore and I came to this conclusion that this abuse was happening, one of the reasons was there just wasn't the precautions in place, either in China or anywhere else, to prevent it from happening. And that still, except, with a few exceptions here and there, still remains largely the case.
Where children were going missing. And they had discussed, although not openly, that the government was taking children. The second student in a different semester said rural families were being paid to give up one of their children. Families in rural areas in China didn't comply with the one-child policy, and so on, had children to give up to get enough money to keep the family alive and being able to support the rest of the family. And in another semester, I had an Australian master's student who knew of an Australian family where a child needed a kidney transplant and they got it from China. Do you know anything about the child organ trafficking? Is this related to the adult? Do you know the sources? Are these stories true that I'm hearing? What do I do when students disclose such an horrific...
First of all, can I thank you for that disclosure and to reassure you that you're in a safe space here to be talking about that stuff. And it's these stories that we need to hear. And also just commend you for wanting to do something about it. So, I thank you for that and for your question. Look, I have also heard anecdotally that it's happening in Indonesia with children as well, and on quite a large scale. And it's absolutely, it's just horrific. What I heard is happening in Indonesia is like anywhere up to 100 to 150 children are just being put in vans and taken off and for their organs. And the source, which I can't disclose the source, is quite a credible source. The Australian Federal Police know about it, as far as I know. I suppose what can we do about it? Look, it takes a lot of courage for these things to be reported, but they should be reported to the police. If we know that there's someone in Australia who has that information, the Australian Federal Police cannot do anything until they get enough intelligence or they get that information. So it is important to make those reports, but I understand the difficulties with that, and also that people fear for their life. So I can't comment much more about in terms of the children stuff that's happening in China, but it's helpful to hear that you're hearing about people going from here to China, because we don't have a very good way of documenting how many people have transplants overseas and come back into this country, and we would like to have much better data around that stuff. What we do know, and it's interesting, Maria's little slide about China saying about the 90% rate of success of the transplant. What we do know is that those people who go overseas and have the transplant and come back to Australia have a less chance of that person accepting that organ. So they do reject the organ. I'm more than happy to speak with you more afterwards if you want to talk about it and talk about some options.
So then would the data be available from our hospital data? So we have, in New South Wales, we have one data source now.
Are sort of informal, not systematic, but surveys done. We do know that there are at least probably several hundred people from Australia going to China for transplants every year. But the problem is that there isn't anything that mandates the reporting of that. So we do know who's in dialysis and who was on dialysis one day and then they're not in dialysis next week. What happened to them? Did they die, or did they get a kidney? We actually don't have that information. I mean, the dialysis centers do know who drops off their rolls, but there isn't any mandated reporting system to report that. And we also don't have any law that says that, if you go and get an organ, you have to declare that on your incoming visa card, along with your Tim Tams. You don't have to do it. You can just come in with your new organ, and you don't have to, say that you're bringing that into the country. So that's one of the things that we've been talking about is, should that law change? Should you have to say, that you're now coming in with a new organ? And there are obviously issues about, healthcare privacy and things that make people not want to make that happen.
Do any of our ESRG codes indicate that coming into our public hospitals as a result of a problem with a recent or not so recent?
Well, but they don't have to report where they got the kid. I mean, we do record, they came in, their graft's failing, they get admitted, maybe they go back on dialysis. So we actually have all of that, but there is no mandated system that says you have to say where your organ came from. All we know is they dropped off the dialysis rolls at one point. And that's exactly how this whole thing was sort of started in Israel, was a doctor knowing that one of his patients said, well, I'm going to China for my heart transplant next week. And he's like, well, how could you schedule it? And that's how this sort of erupted. So we need that system. And the problem is we can't have a system where people go away, come back with an organ, and we say, okay, we're not going to take care of you. We're not going to pay for your post-transplant immunosuppressive drugs, without which you'll die. We can't do that. And so we have to care for people even if they've done this illegal thing. So it's a little bit tricky, and no one has quite figured out how to make the right law around that.
If I may say something, children represent a bit of a different situation or phenomenon than prisoners of conscience, because typically when the prisoners of conscience are rounded up, the children are not. But it's cognate, because what you get with human rights violations is they spread, and if you've got a system that is desensitized, demoralized, operating illegally insofar as there's laws that apply, it just goes into other victim groups, so you need to get the system operating legally to combat this. And of course, children. I mean, this is not just children with organ transplants. One of the other issues I'm involved in is cross-border child sexual abuse, and one of the problems that you get there, which you get here, is, I mean, children are very vulnerable. They can't speak up. They can't defend themselves. So they're very easy population to victimize.
Yeah, thank you. We might just move on to give some limited time. So I think a gentleman at the back there.
I just want to, before I say anything else, just thank you all for being involved in this process. I've been in and out of China now for about...
I think there's still things that can be done. First of all, we can certainly avoid complicity with what's going on in China. Avoiding complicity is entirely within our powers, and we can't just say because China's so powerful we're going to go along. Absolutely not. But even, China today is different from when it was under the time of Mao Zedong, when it was a hermit kingdom and sort of like North Korea, out of contact with the rest of the world. Now they care what other people think about them, and they all, of course, they have a lot of people going out of China from within the country, and so they care what these people hear about China, and that's one of the reasons why it's regrettable that people like Don Monaco and O'Connell are just sort of going along, because it cuts down on that sort of outside pressure. And I think what we can do, even though obviously it's the Chinese have to change China and we can't change China, what we can do is change the political equation that the Communist Party has to deal with. We can increase leverage on China and make the political cost of what they're doing greater than it is now. And I think we should be trying to do that.
Yep. This lady here. Yep. Thank you.
And my question is around the usage of the term genocide, which is being used here in relation to organ trafficking. Have there been investigations into what proportion of ethnic minorities are those that are being subject to the organ trafficking as opposed to the Han majority in China?
Well, of course, I mean, the Chinese don't release statistics about that. So what we're left with is just estimates. And it's easier to, I mean, you can get statistics about volumes because they're posted publicly, even though the government denies its own statistics, but they don't. There isn't statistics of ethnic composition. The Genocide Convention, religion is a ground of genocide, so it isn't just ethnic. And there have been estimates of torture, people survive torture, so there are statistical estimates of torture. And what I've seen, like the UN rapporteur on torture, he said that about 50% of the torture victims were Falun Gong, 11% were Uyghur, 9% were Tibetans, and so, and I mean, this is going back a few years now, but I think at that time that would probably be an accurate balance as well of the organ sourcing. More recently, it looks as if the Uyghurs have been going up, and Falun Gong probably has been going down simply because there aren't the mass arrests now that there was before. The kind of the victimization has stabilized at a relatively high level, but it's the population is being depleted through organ harvesting. The Tibetans is probably about the same level. We've also seen house Christians that have been victimized, and they may not be a significant percentage, but it's still a matter of concern. The other ethnic minorities, Mongolians I haven't heard about, and some of the others, ethnic minorities. I think it's, in terms of ethnic minorities, it's basically the Uyghurs and the Tibetans.
Into this, besides spreading awareness, besides writing to our politicians, besides what else can we do? Secondly, Dr. David, if it's too painful to elaborate, I would imagine the reluctant people giving up their organs aren't treated very nicely. I don't believe, from what I've heard and read, that they are actually unconscious and that they may well be aware of everything that's going on.
I can deal with the first question if you like, David. Look, there are some things that you can do. Now, you don't have to participate in this showing of the hands, but just hands up those who are organ donors in the room. Hands up who aren't. Okay, so those who aren't, you may choose not to for your own beliefs, but if you just haven't done it because you haven't got around to it, that's what you could do. You just go online and you can register, and that's one of the first things that we can do, because this happens because of a supply-demand issue, and you need to just use health economics. You just need to break the supply and demand. That's one little thing that you can, as an individual, as a citizen, that you can do. When you say, apart from just writing to your ministers, well, not many people do that, so I would encourage everyone to keep writing. Writing letters is really important, and letting your ministers know so that they can advocate on your behalf. That's what they're there for. That's why they are paid. They are there to represent you and your constituency. So I think they're really kind of two simple things to do, and to keep talking about the issue. It's really important, and I thank everybody for coming here tonight, because the reason why this issue is different to, say, the Rohingyas issue, which has been happening, is one simple thing. We cannot see what is happening in China. But we've got cameras on the ground in Myanmar reporting, and we've got journalists reporting, but we can't get into China to do that. Okay, so we need to keep talking about it, and we need to keep the issue on the agenda, the political agenda. Just keep talking about it, and even if it's just talking to your neighbour about it, just keep talking about it, because that's the only way that you break silence. David, did you want to take the second part?
Transplantation in China is it's not only legally different or morally different or ethically different, it's also medically different, because elsewhere you get live donors who are alive before and alive afterwards, or deceased donors who are dead before, at least brain dead before, and maybe cardiac alive, but they're dead before and they're dead after. But in China, you get people who are alive before and dead after. They're killed through organ extraction, which, obviously it's morally and ethically wrong, but it also presents a medical problem. And because you have to inject drugs into the person who's alive to make him or her, you need immobilizers, you need anticoagulants, and there's a combination of drugs you need to affect the operation when you're dealing with a live person who's not going to be alive afterwards, because the organ extraction, which you don't get with the transplantation around the rest of the world. And there's been some medical experimentation in China to reduce the amount of drugs you need for these live sources, so you minimize the amount of drugs going into the patient from the organs that are being transplanted. And there was this fellow Wang Lijun who worked for Bo Xilai, who won an award. He was a policeman. He had no medical training, but he set up an experimentation center, and he won an award for his experiments about experimenting with these drugs. And he talks and is accepting the award about killing 1,000 people to doing this. Whether they may not need the anesthetics, as long as the purpose of the anesthetics from their point of view is immobilizing the patient. But if they can immobilize the patient in some other way, then they may not need the anesthetics. And from their point of view, it would be useful not to have the anesthetic, because then the anesthetic wouldn't go into the patient who gets the drug. But this is all going on sort of quasi-secretly, so exactly what's being done, I couldn't tell you, but I know that this is the sort of thing that they've been trying to do, is get the results they need when dealing with this patient, but cutting down on the medication.